On a quiet Sunday evening in southwest London, a woman walked home from church. The streets were dark, but not empty. There were lamps, windows, voices drifting faintly from nearby houses, and the ordinary hush that settles over a respectable neighborhood at the end of the week. She had not been away for long. She had gone out troubled, and she returned still troubled. Something in her home had changed. The small domestic world she depended on, the rooms she knew, the servant she had hired, the routines she expected to hold together, had become tense and uncertain. By the next morning, callers would come to the door and receive answers that seemed strange, but not yet alarming. By midweek, a discovery beside the river would draw police, doctors, reporters, and crowds, and for a while, nobody knew whose story they were looking at. A box in shallow water, a missing woman, a house where the evidence had been cleaned, arranged, and almost carried away. The mystery would travel through London in whispers first, then in newspaper columns, then in courtrooms packed with people who wanted to understand how a quiet home had become the center of one of Victorian England's most unsettling crimes. Tonight, we follow that story slowly. Not for shock, not for spectacle, but to remember the woman at the heart of it, and to understand how a domestic quarrel, a false identity, and a riverbank discovery became known across Britain and Ireland as the Barnes Mystery. Welcome back. Tonight's episode is a calm, true crime story for sleep, told in a steady, respectful way, with the sharper edges softened and the focus kept on the people, the setting, and the documented record. As always, this story involves real people and real loss. We will avoid graphic detail. We will move carefully through the evidence, the investigation, and the long afterlife of the case. The setting is Richmond, London, in 1879. The house is small but respectable. The river is close enough to become part of the story. And at the center is a twice-widowed former schoolteacher named Julia Martha Thomas. Julia Martha Thomas was living alone when the final chapter of her life began. She was in her mid-50s, a former schoolteacher, and a woman who had been widowed twice. Since the death of her second husband in 1873, she had lived at 2 Mayfield cottages, also known in some records as 2 Vine cottages, on Park Road in Richmond. The house was modest but respectable. It stood in a quieter part of the area, with a front garden, a back garden, and the practical spaces expected of a Victorian home. Nearby was a public house called the Hole in the Wall. Beyond the roads and cottages was the River Thames, moving steadily through the landscape, carrying boats, refuse, secrets, and ordinary life. Julia was not truly wealthy, but she maintained a certain appearance of prosperity. She dressed well. She wore jewelry. She wished to keep a servant, partly for help, and partly, perhaps, because a servant was a sign of stability and station. In Victorian England, domestic service shaped many lives. Homes depended on it. Employers expected obedience, regularity, and quiet competence. Servants, often poorly paid and vulnerable, lived close to the families they served, but were not treated as equals. In a small home, the relationship between mistress and servant could become intensely personal. there was little distance. Every habit, every irritation, every late return, every unfinished task could become part of the same enclosed world. Julia had a reputation as a difficult employer. Some neighbors and later writers described her as eccentric, particular, and sometimes hard to please. That does not make her less a victim. It only helps explain the atmosphere of the house, a small place where expectations were high. Patience was limited, and the person living under the same roof might feel watched and criticized from morning until night. Into that household came Kate Webster. Kate Webster was Irish, born Catherine Lawler in County Wexford around 1849. By the time she entered Julia's service, she had already lived through hardship, instability, and repeated brushes with the law. Records and later summaries describe convictions for theft and the use of several aliases. She had a young son, John, whose care was often left to others, while Kate moved between jobs, lodgings, and prison sentences. It is easy in Victorian cases to let the newspapers decide a person's entire character. Kate was described in harsh, moralizing language by reporters and commentators of the time. Some of those descriptions say as much about Victorian fears as they do about Kate herself. A woman who stole, drank, spoke boldly, bore a child outside marriage, and refused to appear meek in court could become, in the public imagination, a symbol of disorder. But this story does not require exaggeration. The facts are enough. Kate Webster came to Julia Martha Thomas through another servant, Sarah Crease, who had fallen ill. Kate had filled in temporarily for a Miss Loder, who knew Julia and understood that Julia wanted a servant. Kate was recommended on the basis of that temporary work. Julia hired her without, it seems, making careful inquiries into her past. At first, things may have seemed manageable. There was work to be done, fires to tend, meals to prepare, rooms to clean, doors to answer, clothes to wash, the usual rhythm of a small Victorian household. But the relationship deteriorated quickly. Julia criticized Kate's work. Kate resented the criticism. The atmosphere became tense enough that Julia reportedly became uncomfortable being alone with her servant. Eventually, Julia gave Kate notice to leave. In Julia's final diary entry, the matter was recorded simply and practically. Catherine was to leave. That was the kind of note a person might write without knowing it would become part of a murder case, a domestic decision, a line in a diary, a boundary drawn between employer and servant. Kate did not leave immediately. She persuaded Julia to keep her for a few more days, and that small extension carried both women into Sunday, March 2nd, 1879. Sunday had its own rhythm in Julia's life. Kate normally had part of the day free, but she was expected to return in time for Julia to attend evening service. That evening, Kate came back late. Julia was delayed. The disagreement between them followed Julia to church. Other worshippers later remembered that Julia seemed agitated. She had been upset by her servant's neglect and by the reaction that followed when she rebuked her. She returned home earlier than expected, sometime around 9 o'clock. What happened inside the house was later described most clearly in Kate Webster's own final confession. According to that account, The two women argued after Julia came home. The quarrel moved upstairs. In anger, Kate caused Julia to fall down the stairs. Then, in fear of the noise and consequences, she took hold of Julia's throat. The later coroner's conclusion, more than a century afterward, would list asphyxiation and head injury as the cause of death. There are reasons to be cautious with any confession, especially one made after a trial, after several earlier statements, and on the eve of execution. Kate had lied before. She had accused others. She had changed her story. Still, her final version broadly matched the physical evidence later considered in the case. What matters most, beneath all the courtroom language, is that Julia Martha Thomas did not leave that house alive. From that moment, Kate Webster's actions turned from violence to concealment. She did not call for help. She did not run into the street. She did not alert a neighbor. Instead, she began trying to erase Julia from the home. In sleep-friendly retelling, we do not need to dwell on the physical details. The documented record shows that Kate separated and concealed Julia's remains, used the household copper, cleaned portions of the house, and packed evidence into containers. She tried to make the house appear ordinary. She dealt with callers. She kept up the fragile performance that Julia was still alive, or away, or unavailable. A neighbor heard a sound on the night of the murder, something like a heavy thud. But in a row of homes, sounds were common. Furniture moved, doors closed, coal scuttles fell. Nobody understood, in that moment, what had happened next door. The following day, people called at the cottage. One caller, William Thomas Dean, came on Monday, March 3rd. He had seen Julia the previous day and expected nothing extraordinary. Kate handled the situation. Her goal was simple: delay discovery. This is one of the unsettling features of the case. The murder itself was sudden, but the concealment required calm, or at least a desperate imitation of calm. Kate had to answer questions. She had to move through rooms where Julia had lived. She had to wear ordinary expressions while doing unordinary things. By Tuesday, March 4th, Kate visited old acquaintances, the Porter family, in Hammersmith. She wore some of Julia's clothing and presented herself under Julia's identity. That deception would become one of the most memorable parts of the case. Kate did not merely hide what had happened. She tried to step into Julia's place. To the Porters, she said she was Mrs. Thomas. She spoke of property, family, and circumstances that were not hers. She began arranging to sell Julia's possessions. She carried bags and boxes. She asked for help. She relied on the ordinary trust of people who did not yet know they had become part of a crime. One of the porters helped carry a heavy box. As they crossed Richmond Bridge, Kate dropped it into the Thames. She explained the moment away. The river accepted the box, at least for the night. But rivers do not always keep what they are given. On the morning of Wednesday, March 5th, 1879, a coal porter named Henry Wheatley was near Barnes Railway Bridge. It was early, shortly before 7. The tide was ebbing. In the shallow water, he saw a wooden box, partly afloat and partly grounded. It was corded. It seemed suspicious enough to inspect. At first, the discovery was strange rather than solved. There was a box. There were human remains. But there was no name attached to them. No clear identity. No immediate link to Julia Martha Thomas. The remains were examined. Reports spread. Newspapers gave the unknown case a name before police could give the victim one. It became the Barnes Mystery, sometimes called the Thames Mystery, because the riverbank discovery came first, and the woman's identity came later. Around the same time, another part of the remains was found in Twickenham. Still, identification was difficult. The head was missing. The early medical opinion was not perfectly accurate. The first inquest produced an open verdict. In those early days, the case floated between fact and speculation. Some thought the remains might have come from anatomical study. Others wondered whether medical students were responsible. Newspapers published details and guesses. The public leaned closer. In Victorian Britain, a mysterious body near the Thames could become a national conversation almost overnight. But while the public watched the river, the answer was still inside the cottage in Richmond. Kate Webster continued her impersonation. She remained at 2 Mayfield cottages for a time, wearing Julia's clothing, speaking as though she had authority over the house, and negotiating the sale of Julia's furniture and belongings. A publican named John Church became involved as a buyer. He believed, at least at first, that he was dealing with a woman who had the right to sell the goods. On March 9th, an agreement was made for the sale of furniture and other items. Money changed hands as an advance. More arrangements followed. The house that had been Julia's home was being emptied under a false name. For nearly 2 weeks, Kate's deception held. But in a neighborhood, absence has a weight. Julia had routines. She had acquaintances. She had people who expected to see her. The longer she remained unseen, the more the ordinary explanations weakened. By March 18th, when a cart arrived to remove furniture, suspicion grew sharp. Julia's next-door neighbor and landlady questioned the removal. When the men indicated that Mrs. Thomas had ordered it, and the person meant was Kate, the fragile performance collapsed. Kate fled. She made her way toward Liverpool, then to Ireland, returning to the area of her family near Enniscorthy, County Wexford. Meanwhile, the police searched 2 Mayfield cottages. There, the case began to join together. Bloodstains, burned bones, traces near the copper, personal items, and a letter that helped point toward Kate's Irish address. The house gave up what the river had not. The investigation then widened across the Irish Sea. Authorities traced Kate to Killan, near Enniscorthy. She was arrested there on the 29th of March, 1879, and brought back to London. The case now had its accused, but it still had layers of confusion. Kate Webster made statements that shifted blame. She implicated John Church. She implicated others. She suggested male accomplices and outside instigators. In doing so, she created a fog around the case, one that required investigators and the court to test alibis, movements, motives, and timelines. Church, Porter, and others had become entangled because they had encountered Kate after the murder, helped move goods, or purchased property. But the evidence ultimately showed that they had been misled rather than involved in Julia's death. This mattered greatly. A murder case is not only about finding the guilty person, it is also about preventing the wrong people from being carried away by suspicion. In the Barnes mystery, Kate's false accusations could have ruined lives in the Victorian courtroom, where public emotion was high and evidence could be circumstantial. Those accusations had real danger. The courtroom was crowded. The case had already become famous. It had the elements that Victorian newspapers amplified: a respectable woman alone, a servant accused of betrayal, a missing body part, a false identity, stolen clothing, and property sold under deception. Kate Webster pleaded not guilty. The prosecution presented a chain of evidence: Julia's disappearance, the discovery at Barnes, Kate's actions after March 2nd, her impersonation of Julia, the attempted sale of the furniture, the signs found in the house, the statements of witnesses who had seen Julia alive before the evening service, and then never again. Witnesses described pieces of the timeline. William Thomas Dean had seen Julia on Sunday, March 2nd. Henry Wheatley described finding the box by the river. Dental evidence connected a gold plate to Julia. Neighbors and acquaintances described visits, clothing, furniture, conversations, and moments that had seemed harmless before they were placed inside the larger pattern. The defense emphasized uncertainty. Much of the evidence was circumstantial. Kate had not been seen committing the murder. The exact sequence inside the house depended partly on inference and partly on Kate's shifting words. But circumstantial evidence can still be strong when many independent facts point in the same direction. The jury deliberated for about an hour and a quarter. On the 8th of July, 1879, Kate Webster was found guilty of the willful murder of Julia Martha Thomas. After the verdict, Kate still denied direct guilt, though she withdrew some accusations against others. She claimed that another man, unnamed in any useful way, had led her into the situation. The judge did not accept this as a reason to alter the outcome. Then came an unusual and dramatic moment. Kate pleaded that she was pregnant, a claim that, under older legal procedures, could delay execution if she were found to be quick with child. A jury of matrons was assembled from women present in court. They examined her and rejected the plea. The sentence stood. In the days before her execution, Kate gave further statements. The final one, made at Wandsworth Prison, took sole responsibility and cleared church, porter, and strong of direct involvement. On July 29th, 1879, she was executed at Wandsworth Prison. That was the legal end of the case. But it was not the end of the story. For decades, the Barnes mystery remained both solved and unfinished. The court had named the killer. The motive had been sketched: anger, resentment, greed, and perhaps the desperate hope of profit. The timeline had been reconstructed. The false identity had been exposed. The property had been traced. Kate Webster had confessed before her death. But Julia Martha Thomas's head had not been found. That absence left a strange open space in an otherwise closed case. In historical memory, it became part of the story's shadow. People repeated rumors. Some were true, many were not. The most sensational claims, including stories about dripping and lard, were often repeated without firm proof. Over time, the crime became wrapped in Victorian myth-making, newspaper language, and the public fascination with women who committed violence. The house itself became notorious. For a time, people were reluctant to live there. Visitors treated the place almost like a grim landmark. The quiet domestic cottage had been transformed into a symbol. And then, more than 130 years later, the case returned. In October 2010, workmen carrying out building work near the former hole in the wall pub on property connected with Sir David Attenborough's Richmond home uncovered a human skull. The location was close to where Julia had lived. The circumstances immediately raised the possibility that this was the missing part of the Barnes mystery. Modern investigators looked backward. They considered historical records, the location, the age of the remains, and forensic details. Carbon dating placed the skull within a range that could include the 19th century. The condition of the skull and the injuries were consistent with the known history of the case. DNA identification was not possible, partly because Julia had no known direct descendants, and the precise burial location of the rest of her remains had not been recorded in a way that allowed comparison. Even without DNA, the evidence was compelling. In July 2011, the coroner formally concluded that the skull was that of Julia Martha Thomas. The verdict was unlawful killing. The cause of death was recorded as asphyxiation and head injury. A mystery that began beside the Thames in 1879 had found its final witness in a garden more than a century later. It is tempting, in stories like this, to let the killer dominate the memory. Kate Webster became a Victorian figure of fascination, drawn, described, judged, displayed in wax, and written about in language that often mixed fact with fear. The public wanted to understand her, condemn her, stare at her, and turn her into a warning. But Julia Martha Thomas deserves the center of the story. She was not merely the victim in the box, or the mistress, or the woman from Richmond. She was a person with a full life before the final days. A teacher, a wife twice bereaved, a woman maintaining her place in a world that could be lonely and exacting. She lived in rooms she tried to keep respectable. She attended church. She kept a diary. She made decisions about her household. She expected, as anyone would, to be safe in her own home. The horror of the Barnes mystery is not only in what happened after Julia died, it is in the betrayal of the ordinary. A servant hired for help, a Sunday routine, a disagreement over lateness, a familiar staircase, a river close enough to carry evidence away. The case also reminds us how truth can emerge in fragments: a neighbor's memory, a dental plate, a box on the riverbank, a suspicious furniture sale, a letter left behind, a witness who saw someone in the wrong clothes, a confession given too late to save anyone, but not too late to clear the innocent. And finally, many generations later, a skull under old ground. The Thames kept moving. Richmond changed. The pub closed. Houses were altered. Names passed from newspapers into archives. Yet the record remained. waiting for the moment when old testimony and modern science could meet. Tonight, when we leave the story, we leave it quietly, with Julia Martha Thomas restored by name, with the false stories separated from the documented facts, with the house no longer just a place of fear, but a reminder that behind every famous crime is a private life interrupted, and with the river flowing past Barnes and Richmond, carrying the memory of a mystery that was almost hidden, then almost forgotten. And finally, after 132 years, more fully understood. Thank you for listening. If this calm, true crime story helped you settle in tonight, you can stay with the channel for more quiet, respectful cases told for sleep, reflection, and black screen listening. Rest well, and take care.